I played trombone because they watched Star Trek and they were big fans of the show. I think gorgeous cinematography, and especially all the new Star Trek, encouraged to shoot sort of cinematically and filmically. And
Star Trek turned out to be a huge success. But what no one knows is that Star Trek would never have made it to the cinema. And the reason was simple. It had disturbing occurrences and narratives that were not suitable for airing. If you look closely at the scenes, you'd notice a few inconsistencies. Well, those are residues from the parts that were erased to produce a flawless show. Join us in this video as we look through the original disturbing version of Star Trek that was erased by the studio. The erased version of Star Trek that showed its flaws. Given what it takes to film a show like Star Trek, every episode could honestly be its own documentary. Across just 7 years, they produced 178 episodes, and that came with an intense schedule. Filming days regularly stretched 16 to 18 hours. It was exhausting work, plain and simple. In fact, Kate Mulgrew was partly cast as Captain Janeway in Voyager because the original actor didn't fully realize how demanding the job was, and quit just 2 days into filming. To put it in perspective, some scenes, like quiet conversations in Picard's ready room with Riker, were often shot at around 2 a.m., long after most of the cast had already wrapped for the day. And then there's a more amusing scene that had to be cut. LeVar Burton, who played Geordi LaForge, sometimes used his visor to sneak in short naps during filming. In Season 1, he spent a lot of time on the bridge with minimal dialogue. So when he wasn't needed in the scene, he would quietly close his eyes and rest, knowing he'd still appear in the background. Ironically, Burton now actually narrates sleep stories on the Calm app, guiding listeners through space-themed tales designed to help them drift off. Although fan support and box office success kept the Star Trek franchise going for decades after the original run, there was often a lot happening behind the scenes, especially tensions around contracts, money, and royalties. But on the set, despite some issues in the writer's room, Gene Roddenberry had a very different kind of influence on the cast. He developed a close, almost paternal relationship with many of them. He regularly took time between filming to encourage actors to shape their characters and the world they were building in their own way. This was especially true for Jonathan Frakes, who played Riker. Roddenberry worked closely with him, even encouraging him to keep a subtle, Gary Cooper-like glint in his performance. Cool, confident, and effortlessly composed. There's another originality that was erased from the public eye. It had to do with the door. Those iconic Star Trek doors were a huge part of the show's look. That smooth whoosh sound, it's become instantly recognizable, even outside the fan community. But here's the catch. That sound wasn't real. Behind the scenes, the doors had a pretty big flaw. The sleek, futuristic sound you hear was added later during post-production. On set, the doors were actually loud, really loud, and not futuristic at all. In fact, they were so noisy that they often drowned out the actors. Because of that, there's a small detail you might never have noticed. Characters almost never speak while the doors are opening or closing. And fair warning, once you notice it, you won't be able to unsee it. Because the doors were so loud, the cast had to pause their lines and wait for stagehands to finish opening or closing them. That way, the editors could easily cut out the harsh clunk-clank noise and replace it with that smooth, iconic whoosh. Between Seasons 1 and 2, Michael Dorn's original head prosthetic was stolen. No one at Paramount ever figured out who took it or why. One theory suggests some cast or crew members grabbed souvenirs, thinking the show might not get renewed. Whatever the truth, the production team suddenly needed a replacement and took the chance to redesign and improve Worf's look going forward. The look of Klingon cranial ridges became a bit inconsistent. And honestly, that's kind of a perfect pun. What other details were erased from the blockbuster, and why? Keep watching to find out. The people and equipments that never made it to the final show. When Gene Roddenberry first pitched Star Trek to NBC, William Shatner wasn't his original choice for Captain. The network was already backing Jeffrey Hunter, the Hollywood actor best known for playing Jesus Christ in King of Kings. Hunter went on to film the original pilot as Captain Christopher Pike. His version of the captain was serious, thoughtful, and deeply philosophical, exactly the tone Roddenberry wanted. But then he walked away. Some say his wife didn't think television was the right move. Others say Hunter himself felt the project wasn't the right fit for his career. Whatever the reason, he was gone. That's when William Shatner stepped in. Where Hunter was restrained, Shatner was bold, expressive, and magnetic. And almost instantly, the entire tone of the show shifted the moment he took command of the bridge. Tragically, Hunter passed away just 3 years later at the age of 42, never seeing how Star Trek would become a cultural phenomenon. Spock, as we know him, almost looked very different. Very different. In Gene Roddenberry's early concept notes, Spock was described with reddish skin, unsettling, alien, and intentionally otherworldly. Early design sketches leaned heavily into that idea, giving him a more satanic visual presence. But then reality got in the way. Black and white television. In the 1960s, most American households still watched TV in black and white. On screen, red skin would have appeared very dark, almost black, which would have completely changed the intended impression. So the design was adjusted to a greenish-yellow tone instead. It was subtle enough to suggest something alien, but light enough to translate properly on monochrome screens. The irony is that when Star Trek finally aired in color, the effect was so subtle most viewers didn't even notice it. But it didn't matter. Spock's pointed ears did most of the visual storytelling anyway. And the rest, as they say, is history. But adjusting Spock's look was only the beginning. Ask any Star Trek fan to name their favorite piece of technology, and chances are the transporter will come up. It's one of the most famous ideas in science fiction, the ability to break down a human body at the molecular level and reassemble it somewhere else instantly. But here's the truth Gene Roddenberry probably wouldn't have highlighted in the pitch meeting. The transporter wasn't born from creative ambition. It was born from a budget problem. Originally, the plan was much simpler and far more expensive. The crew would travel to planets using shuttlecraft. That meant landing sequences, approach shots, and full exterior filming every time. It would have looked impressive, but it would also have been far too costly for a weekly TV show. So the production team needed a cheaper solution, quickly. That solution became the transporter effect. It was created using a simple technique. Sparkling material was filmed falling in front of a dark background, then the footage was reversed and combined with light effects. The result looked futuristic enough to sell the illusion, at a tiny fraction of the cost of filming shuttle landings. What started as a budget-saving workaround ended up becoming one of the most iconic visuals in the entire Star Trek franchise. Today, physicists still debate whether true teleportation could ever exist. Scientists at universities around the world run experiments inspired by the idea. And all of it traces back to a TV production team that simply couldn't afford to build a shuttlecraft. How much did this alter in the series' storyline? What else never made it to the final output of the show? Let's see. Martin Luther King Jr. played a role no one ever saw. Most TV shows get one shot with a network. Star Trek got something rare, a second chance, but only after being told its first attempt was completely wrong. The original pilot, The Cage, was submitted to NBC in 1965. The response was harsh, too intellectual, too slow, and not action-packed enough. Even the female first officer, played by Majel Barrett, was considered too controversial for the time. NBC rejected it outright, but instead of canceling the project, the network did something unusual. They ordered a second pilot, almost unheard of in television at the time. Roddenberry went back to the drawing board. Out went number one. In came Captain Kirk, Spock, and a much more action-driven tone. But The Cage wasn't wasted. Roddenberry later reused its footage in a two-part episode called The Menagerie. That episode went on to win a Hugo Award, meaning the rejected pilot eventually became award-winning television. Still, even after nearly being scrapped, Star Trek continued to push boundaries in unexpected ways, and one actress in particular almost walked away from the show before realizing just how important her role would become. That actress was Nichelle Nichols. In 1960s American television, Nichelle Nichols was already doing something quietly revolutionary just by appearing on screen. As Lieutenant Uhura, she portrayed one of the first black women in a major non-servant role on mainstream TV. She had authority, intelligence, and importance within the crew. She wasn't background decoration, she was essential. But after the first season, she decided to leave. Broadway was calling, and she handed in her resignation to Gene Roddenberry. Then, something unexpected happened. At an NAACP event, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked to meet her. He told Nichols that her role on Star Trek mattered, that Uhura was more than just a character. For the first time, young black children could see someone who looked like them serving as an officer, a professional, someone with dignity at the highest level of space exploration. That conversation changed everything. The next day, she withdrew her resignation. Later, she described that moment as one of the most important of her life. Away from her, the spotlight goes to Leonard and Spock. Today, Leonard Nimoy and Spock feel inseparable. But in the early days of production, Nimoy wasn't sure the role would work, or even if he should take it. His biggest concern was Spock's appearance. The pointed ears, the greenish tint, the alien design, it all worried him. He feared the character might come off as a monster, rather than a serious, relatable figure. Worse, he worried it could limit him to novelty roles for the rest of his career. He also struggled with the performance itself. Spock required emotional restraint, almost complete suppression of expression, something very different from the kind of acting Nimoy was trained to do. It forced him to rethink everything about his instincts as a performer. What ultimately changed things was the audience response. Viewers didn't see a monster or a gimmick. They saw depth beneath the calm exterior and emotion beneath the logic. Nimoy later wrote 2 autobiographies. The first was I Am Not Spock. The second, years later, was I Am Spock. The contrast between those 2 titles says everything about his evolving relationship with the character. Were there external factors that affected the airing of these scenes, or did they just come off as too disturbing to air? Keep watching to find out. The show was nearly cut short. On November 22, 1968, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura shared a kiss, often cited as one of the first interracial kisses ever shown on American primetime television. But what many people don't realize is how strongly the network tried to stop it. NBC pushed for changes to the scene, even suggesting that the kiss be forced rather than consensual, caused by telekinetic aliens or some external influence. That way, certain stations, especially in the South, could dismiss it as not real, but rather alien mind control. However, William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols had other plans. They deliberately kept ruining the takes where they turned away from each other, making them unusable. Eventually, the production was left with the version where they naturally faced each other, and that's the one that aired. The network got its cover story. The audience got the real moment. Nichelle Nichols later shared a powerful story about receiving a letter from a white Southern viewer who said that scene made him rethink his beliefs entirely. One brief kiss on a sci-fi show ended up changing how someone saw the world. However, what most people don't know is that Star Trek was never a huge ratings success in its original run. After the first season, NBC began seriously considering cancellation. By the second season, the pressure was even greater. But then something unusual happened, something almost unheard of in television at the time. Fan response started to become impossible to ignore. Fans organized quickly. Over the course of 2 campaigns, it's estimated that more than 1 million letters and pieces of correspondence flooded NBC's offices. Petitions were signed across college campuses. Fans even staged protests outside NBC headquarters. For a fan base with no internet, no social media, and no digital tools, it was an extraordinary display of collective effort. And it worked. Twice. NBC renewed Star Trek for a 3rd season, even making a public announcement at a fan convention. It was one of the earliest clear examples of audience pressure directly influencing a network's cancellation decision. However, that 3rd season came with problems. It was underfunded and pushed into a difficult Friday night time slot. The show was ultimately canceled in 1969. But there was a twist. That final season gave Star Trek enough episodes to qualify for syndication, and that changed everything. Again, there's something that still baffles audiences about Star Trek. The spacecraft used, the USS Enterprise, NCC-1701, is one of the most iconic spacecraft in science fiction history. But the original filming model had a secret the cameras were never meant to reveal. The 11-foot model was incredibly detailed, but only on the parts the audience would actually see. The top surfaces, nacelles, and saucer section were carefully painted and finished. The underside, however, was largely left incomplete, rough, unpainted in places, and far less refined. The reason was simple. Every shot was framed from above or the side. There was no need, and no budget, to finish areas that would never appear on camera. Today, that original model is preserved in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. If you ever managed to look underneath it, you'd be staring at the unfinished underside of one of the most famous vehicles in storytelling history. This one almost feels impossible because it sounds so right. "Beam me up, Scotty," is one of the most iconic lines in pop culture. It's been printed on t-shirts, bumper stickers, mugs, you name it, for decades. It even made its way into space when astronauts aboard the International Space Station referenced it after James Doohan, the actor who played Scotty, passed away. And yet, the exact phrase never appears in the original Star Trek series. Not once.
Nowhere in the entirety of the original Star Trek were the words "Beam me up, Scotty" ever uttered. They did come close several times, such as in the 1969 episode of the original series, The Savage Curtain, where Kirk says, "Scotty, beam us up, fast!"
What Captain Kirk actually says in different episodes are variations like "Beam us up, Scotty," "Scotty, beam me up," or simply "Beam me up." Close, but never the exact wording that became famous. Somehow, over time, the line we remember is the one that never actually existed. And this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. "Play it again, Sam," was never said in Casablanca. "Elementary, my dear Watson," never appears in the original Sherlock Holmes stories. And even in Star Wars, the famous line isn't quite right. Darth Vader actually says, "No, I am your father." Memory has a way of reshaping dialogue until it becomes something more iconic than what was originally written. But what makes the Star Trek case especially interesting is that the misquote ended up becoming more famous than anything actually said on the show. How original was the original version of Star Trek? Were there stuffs we thought were real that turned out fake? Let's see. The original Star Trek borrowed a lot of costumes. Star Trek introduced viewers to a galaxy full of alien civilizations. Week after week, the Enterprise crew encountered strange species with unusual clothing, armor, and ceremonial dress. On screen, it all looked carefully designed and completely original. And it was, but not always in the way you might expect. The costume department was creative, but it was also extremely resourceful. Much of what appeared as alien wardrobe was actually recycled from existing studio stock, clothing from earlier films and television shows that had simply been reworked. In the 1960s, Hollywood studios kept massive costume warehouses filled with outfits from decades of productions. Star Trek regularly pulled from these archives. Roman-style robes became alien ceremonial garments. Old Western outfits were repurposed into the clothing of distant civilizations. Even aging science fiction costumes were given fresh paint and new insignias to feel like something entirely new. And if you looked closely, you might sometimes recognize them. A familiar costume from a historical epic reappearing on an alien world, or a medieval outfit rebranded as interstellar fashion. What looked like a vast, endlessly original universe was often built from pieces of Hollywood's past, cleverly reused and reimagined. The costume team had a real gift for transformation, taking everyday, ordinary materials and turning them into something strange and unfamiliar. It was creative problem-solving under pressure, and it worked. On television, especially in an era when people were watching in their living rooms rather than in cinemas, the illusion only needed to hold for a few seconds at a time. And when you're building an entire universe on a tight budget, even the most iconic weapons can have surprisingly humble origins. The phaser, the standard sidearm of Starfleet, could stun, heat, or even disintegrate targets. It became one of the most recognizable weapons in all of science fiction. But in its earliest form, It was essentially a toy. The prop department began with plastic toy ray guns already available in the studio's inventory, cheap novelty items, and leftover props from earlier productions. From there, they modified them heavily, adding new paint, attaching extra components, and reshaping details to make them look more advanced and futuristic. The result still carried a slightly toy-like quality if you looked closely. Fans noticed it even back then. The plastic finish wasn't entirely convincing, and the proportions weren't quite what you'd expect from a high-tech weapon. But on screen, with the right lighting, camera angles, and sound design, they worked perfectly. They became believable instruments of the future. And ironically, the design influence didn't stop at television. Phaser concepts went on to inspire real-world research into directed energy weapons. The U.S. military has, over the decades, invested millions of dollars into directed energy weapons, laser-based systems that are essentially direct descendants of ideas first popularized by Star Trek. In a strange twist, what began as a repainted toy gun on a TV set helped inspire real-world research programs. But not all of the show's creative, budget-driven solutions went as smoothly. Sometimes, they created unexpected problems the cast had to deal with in real time. An example is the Tribbles. Few episodes capture the playful spirit of Star Trek better than The Trouble with Tribbles, where the Enterprise is suddenly overwhelmed by small, fluffy, fast-multiplying creatures called Tribbles. It's one of the show's most beloved and comedic stories. But behind the scenes, those adorable creatures caused a very different kind of trouble. The Tribbles themselves were simple props, foam spheres covered in synthetic fur, with some versions containing small motors to create a gentle purring vibration. On camera, they looked charming and harmless. Under the intense studio lighting of a 1960s television set, however, they turned into something unexpected: static electricity machines. The synthetic fur would heat up under the lights and build significant static charge. As a result, Tribbles stuck to actors' costumes, clung to set furniture, and even attached themselves to camera equipment. Crew members regularly received small electric shocks while handling them. And because the episode required hundreds of Tribbles, the problem only got worse the more they were used. What looked cute and simple on screen was, in practice, a constantly sparking, mildly chaotic production challenge. The production team eventually had to come up with ways to manage the Tribbles between takes, carefully discharging the props and limiting how long they stayed under the hot studio lights before filming resumed. All of this just to get through an episode about cute fictional creatures without shocking the cast or crew. How did Star Trek become so loved despite the disturbing version that never made it to screens? Keep watching to find out. The Star Trek story. On March 11, 1964, Gene Roddenberry, an established writer and lifelong science fiction fan, drafted a short proposal for a new television series called Star Trek. His idea was set aboard a large starship named the SS Yorktown, operating in the 23rd century, with a crew tasked with exploring the Milky Way galaxy. Roddenberry drew inspiration from several sources. These included A.E. Van Vogt's Space Beagle stories, Eric Frank Russell's Marathon series, and the 1956 film Forbidden Planet. Some also note similarities to the TV series Rocky Jones, Space Ranger, which featured comparable elements such as ship structure, crew dynamics, and mission-based storytelling. He was also heavily influenced by C.S. Forrester's Horatio Hornblower novels, which follow a bold naval captain operating far from home under broad authority. Roddenberry often joked that Captain Kirk was essentially Horatio Hornblower in space. Before science fiction, Roddenberry had written extensively for Western television series in the 1950s and 1960s. That influence is clear in his original pitch, which he described as Wagon Train to the Stars. Like Wagon Train, each episode would be a self-contained adventure, framed within a larger journey.
Now, when Gene Roddenberry first made the pitch for Star Trek in 1964, the captain of the SS Yorktown, which was the original name of the ship, was Robert April.
In his earliest version, the main character was Captain Robert April, commander of the SS Yorktown. This concept later evolved into Captain Christopher Pike, first portrayed by Jeffrey Hunter. According to various official sources, Robert April is considered the Enterprise's first commanding officer, preceding Pike. The character has appeared on screen only once in Star Trek, the animated series The Counterclock Incident, and much later in Star Trek, Strange New Worlds, where he is portrayed by Adrian Holmes. Lloyd Bridges was once offered a starring role in what would eventually become Star Trek. He declined, saying he had a good personal relationship with Gene Roddenberry, but simply wasn't interested in working in science fiction. In April 1964, Roddenberry took his Star Trek proposal to Desilu Productions, a major independent television studio. There he met Herbert F. Solow, Desilu's director of production, who saw potential in the idea and signed Roddenberry to a 3-year development deal. Lucille Ball, who headed Desilu, wasn't initially familiar with the concept, but she played a key role in helping secure production of the pilot. During development, the idea evolved significantly. The first filmed pilot, The Cage, produced in late 1964, differed in several ways from Roddenberry's original treatment. For example, Solow introduced the concept of star dates. At the time, Desilu had a first-look arrangement with CBS. Oscar Katz, Desilu's vice president of production, joined Roddenberry in pitching the series to the network, but CBS passed, already having a similar project in development, Irwin Allen's Lost in Space. In May 1964, Solow, drawing on his previous experience at NBC, met with Grant Tinker, then head of West Coast programming for the network. Tinker agreed to commission a pilot episode which became The Cage. However, NBC ultimately rejected that first pilot, describing it as too cerebral. Despite this, executives still saw potential in the concept and acknowledged that some of the issues came from the specific script they had chosen to produce. As a result, NBC made an unusual decision. They funded a second pilot, titled Where No Man Has Gone Before. Only Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy, was carried over from the first pilot. Of the original cast, only Nimoy and Majel Barrett remained in the transition to the series. This second pilot was successful, and NBC approved Star Trek for its fall 1966 television lineup. The second pilot introduced most of the characters who would go on to define Star Trek. Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, took command. James Doohan appeared as Chief Engineer Scotty, and George Takei was introduced as Sulu, initially a physicist in the pilot, before becoming the ship's helmsman for the rest of the series. Paul Fix played Dr. Mark Piper in the second pilot, but when the full series began, DeForest Kelley joined as Dr. Leonard McCoy. He remained throughout the show's run and eventually became one of its central stars. Whose efforts added to the show's captivating cinema? What characters were key to the success of the show? Let's see. The people who kept the show alive. During the first season, more key crew members were added. Nichelle Nichols played Lieutenant Nyota Uhura, breaking new ground as one of the first black women in a prominent, non-subservient role on American television. Grace Lee Whitney appeared as Janice Rand, the captain's yeoman, though she left midway through the season. Majel Barrett returned as Nurse Christine Chappell, assisting Dr. McCoy. In the second season, Walter Koenig joined the cast as Ensign Pavel Chekhov. But even before the first episode aired, the show nearly didn't make it. In February 1966, Star Trek came close to being canceled by Desilu Productions. At the time, the studio had taken on a financial risk, moving from producing a single half-hour show to supporting 2 expensive hour-long series, Mission, Impossible, and Star Trek. The costs were mounting, and the situation was uncertain. However, Herbert Solow stepped in and convinced Lucille Ball to keep both shows alive, a decision that would prove to be incredibly important for television history. Once Star Trek was officially picked up by NBC, production moved to Desilu Productions' Gower Street studio, formerly used by RKO Pictures, and now part of the Paramount Pictures lot. Filming primarily took place on stages 31 and 32. The show's visual identity was shaped by art director Matt Jefferies, who designed the USS Enterprise and most of its interiors. His work became so iconic that the maintenance shafts seen throughout later Star Trek series were named Jefferies tubes in his honor. Jefferies also helped design the show's handheld phasers, alongside his brother, John Jefferies. He played a major role in creating the Enterprise bridge as well, building on an earlier concept by Pato Guzman. Drawing from his experience as a World War II airman, Jeffries approached the design like an aircraft cockpit, functional, efficient, and believable as a real working space. Costume designer Bill Thies was responsible for the distinctive look of Starfleet uniforms, as well as outfits for guest characters and alien species. His work helped define the visual style of races like the Klingons, Vulcans, Romulans, Andorians, and others. Meanwhile, artist and sculptor Wat Chang, who had previously worked with Walt Disney Productions, was brought in to design and build many of the show's props. He created the iconic flip-open communicator, which is often credited as an early inspiration for modern mobile phones. Chang also designed the tricorder, a portable device used for scanning and data analysis, along with various tools seen in engineering and sickbay. As the series went on, he contributed to the creation of several memorable alien species, including the Gorn and the Horta. Together, this team turned limited resources into a rich, believable universe that still influences science fiction design today. What do you think about the disturbing version of Star Trek? Do you think taking that version out helped make the show better? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us. Look through the not-so-known version of Star Trek that never made it to screens. We hope you found this video both interesting and thrilling. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video on your screen to explore more interesting discoveries. See you there.